When did you start here at WSET?
I started in the summer of 1975 as a master control room operator. I had extensive broadcast history, but on both sides of the camera. But I had an engineering license, and that's the reason they needed someone with a license to run the station, and I had that, so I got hired at that. But I already had experience fill-in anchor, fill-in weather, fill-in sports.
Here?
No, in Tennessee at WLVA, Channel 11 in Johnson City, Tennessee. But I'd also worked with public television at WBRA, helping to produce and do one-act television shows from high schools back in the 60s. So
what did you transition to first from master control?
Well, the first thing that happened was we had a young lady who did weather, and she had an emergency appendectomy. The person who normally filled in for her was the assignment editor news director, and he had the flu and couldn't do it. So they needed someone who had experience. I was here in a flannel shirt and bib overalls and a beard down to here, and I called my roommate. He brought trimmers and a suit, and I trimmed my beard way down and ended up doing the weather for 3 or 4 days. And they were like, you really know what you're doing? And I'm like, I've done it before. So anyway, then there was a 5-person newsroom then. I was the 6th person for a year before they started adding people in the news department. Now I guess there's like 30 or 40 folks doing it in front of the camera and a lot behind the camera.
So so you came in as a reporter more, or both?
Well, at that point in time, I became a reporter, photographer, producer, a lot of different hats. When you have a small newsroom, there are a lot of different hats. And I had learned to shoot black and white film. I started in my broadcast career as a radio guy, but I transitioned over to TV and shot black and white film and developed it and edited it, so I knew how to do that. So I got to shoot color film here. It was wonderful until we got to the end of the month, because when we ran out of our month's allotment, we had to go 2 or 3 days without film till our new allotment came in. So we had to be very judicious in that period. Then, of course, we transitioned to videotape, and the rest is history. Now it's all digital.
Yeah. Well, you had a very small news department, and how many newscasts would you put on in a week?
Well, we only did 10 in a week. We did at that time, it was a 5:30 newscast, and they had 2 national feeds at 6 and 6:30, and we did a 5:30 newscast, and then we did an 11 o'clock newscast, 5 days a week, and that was it. That's all she wrote. And on some days off, I filled in back in the control room. And back then, it was a film chain and a slide drum and 3 2-inch videotape machines. And if you had a 2-minute break and you had 4 spots, you had to pop a commercial off of one machine and put another one on before the minute was up. So I mean, it was different things. And I got a couple of pictures of the old master control room on your flash drive for you.
Oh, fun. So in your days as a reporter, can you think of some of the very biggest news stories for this whole region?
Well, the ones that stand out, of course, are the flood in '85 when the James River came up into the lower basin. All that. Sorry. Come on, there you go. Some of the biggest stories were like in 1985 when the James River came up and to all that area that's been redone down on Jefferson Street, the lower basin. There used to be a lot of buildings there where the park is now, and those were all flooded. I mean, up to the roof flooded. It was up to the bridge at that time, and people were worried about the bridge. They wouldn't let anybody cross it because it was in such bad shape, the old Williams Viaduct. And so that was a big, huge story. And then, of course, the Haysom murders. The Haysoms happened to be friends of mine. I lived above them in a flat above them when they first came to Lynchburg. That was a huge story. There were lots of things like that occurred.
Let's talk a little bit more about like the flood of '85.
Yeah.
How you had a small team at that point, right? Still.
Yeah, we had about 8 or 10 people at the time, and it was an election. It was election day, so we were covering elections, and it was flooding in downtown Lynchburg, and we had to send people out, as soon as we finished our election coverage, to go cover that. So we were shooting film at night or video at night, and then the next day it was still up into the basin, and there were fires out in the fire department couldn't get to it because it was flooded. I mean, it was a big, huge mess, and Treasure Island was destroyed. The bridge to Treasure Island, which was Liberty Football's practice field, was taken out, so all their equipment was washed downstream. People are still finding Liberty Football equipment from 1985 downstream. So.
And then the Haysom murders.
Yeah, it was a grisly situation. They had been dead for a couple of days before they were found. They didn't show up at a bridge club that they normally participated in, and that's when they were found and discovered. And it was a pretty strange situation. A lot of the whole area of Boonesboro was just freaked out. They were worried that some serial killer was out and about, and they didn't understand what was going on. It happened over Easter break, so it was a huge outpouring of fear.
Yeah, and I imagine as a newsroom, trying to figure it all out and cover it was.
Well, I knew that.
Twist and turn every moment.
I knew the Haysoms, and as soon as I heard the address on the scanner, I said, I know who lives there, and we sent a reporter photographer and staked them out. And they called back and said, we're going to be here for a while. So the newscast was over. I took them food. And while I was there, Sheriff Carl Wells said, you knew these folks? And I was like, yeah. And he took me inside the house, which caused quite an uproar with all the other journalists, but it was a pretty grisly scene. It was terrible. It was awful. He was the Lee Iacocca of Nova Scotia. He had turned a big, huge plant operation around up there. And nobody understood what had happened.
Yeah, and then the surprise of who got arrested eventually for that.
Well, I think there was some. I think in the back of some folks' minds that they were the prime suspects to begin with, but they had an answer for everything, so to speak. And I think Jens Soring thought he was smarter than everybody else, and then when things started going south, that's when they ran, and then it kind of opened things up, and everything, people understood why the sheriff and the folks that were investigating it decided not to talk too much about it.
Mm-hmm. UVA, I remember you talking about
there was a U-Haul van accident. Fraternity at UVA had loaded up a U-Haul van half full of beer and the other half full of fraternity members, and they were coming to Lynchburg to go to Randolph-Macon for an event. And they were coming down the hill at Madison Heights, and they were going too fast, and they rolled over onto a Volkswagen. And a couple of people were killed and several guys injured, and the guy in the Volkswagen was injured. And of course, it was against U-Haul policy to haul kids around, but fraternities all over the country had been doing it for a long time. And it was a terrible, terrible accident. We won some awards for our coverage of that event. So, yeah, that was a bad story.
Oh, I thought more than a couple. I thought
a lot were injured. There were, if you go back and look, I want to say only 2, maybe 3 passed away. 2 immediately, or 1 or 2 immediately, and the others at the hospital. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people that were taken to the hospital.
Yeah. And then what about Larry Flint and Jerry Falwell, that whole thing? Were you covering that?
Yeah. Jerry Falwell had started the Moral Majority and had become a national figure, speaking out against a lot of things. And Larry Flint put an ad, a satire ad about alcohol in his magazine that featured Jerry Falwell as I like my alcohol and I drink a lot. And then I'm not talking about Jerry Falwell Jr. I'm talking about Jerry Falwell Sr. And he sued them. and that put them more in the national spotlight. I don't think that Jerry Falwell or Larry Flint could have paid money that gave them the exposure that they got. I think it really was beneficial to both of them. Falwell's moral majority grew as a result, and Flint's subscriptions grew for Hustler magazine. So it was a really interesting time, and Jerry became a powerhouse in the political scene with moral majority. And of course, then there was Jim Baker, and all that PTL business that Jerry was involved in, and that created a huge, a lot of news, a lot of coverage. It was a national story.
Was that during your tenure?
Yeah.
Was Jerry Falwell, was this all growing while you were covering him?
Yes, yeah.
His national.
Yeah, as a matter of fact.
Majority created while you were here?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I attended the debates between Carter and Ford, and I attended debates between Ford and Reagan. Carter and Reagan, and I made some national contacts, and I became a contact for the ABC Washington desk, and kept them apprised of what was going on with Jerry and what was happening here, and we had daily calls. Conference calls with TV stations all over the country from the Washington desk. And the desk assignment editor at that time was Stone Phillips. And so I don't know if anybody remembers the name Stone Phillips, but he went on to be something at NBC. But anyway, I became a contact for them. We talked every day about Jerry on the conference call and what was going on with him. So it was interesting times.
Yeah. Are there any other news stories you can think of?
Not off the top of my head. I'm old, fat, and forgetful. I do remember this. I used to watch Channel 13. We used to have to turn our antenna on our house. I'm from Martinsville, Virginia, and we had the fortunate of being in between Roanoke, Lynchburg, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and Raleigh. And on a good day, we could pick up Raleigh, and we could pick up Greensboro and Winston-Salem, High Point, all the stations. But yeah, we watched Kitty College and Mr. The Movie Man and the Silver Dollar Dance Group. So yeah, as a teenager, I got to watch a lot of that, and I had a big interest in television back as a teenager. So.
Now, was Jim Stapleton still here when you first started?
Jim Stapleton had moved into sales when I came, but he still did production. He did a lot of production. There's a famous picture of Jim Stapleton with a WLVA microphone. And the station decided to get rid of that, and Jim said, "I'll take it." And when Jim passed away, he left that microphone to me, and I believe it still works. We can test it out and check if somebody wants to, but yeah, so that WLVA microphone was the flagship of when it was WLVA. Of course, then it changed to WSET, and that was a big to-do. It was a big thing. And we got a new transmitter and everything as a result. So
he was on the air in the 50s through?
The 50s, yeah. When the station started, he was doing radio here. He was a radio announcer, and they did radio shows. And they did radio shows in the studio, and that was down on Church Street. And they moved up here when they built this building, and they thought this was a huge improvement. And of course, the building was added on to like 3 times while I was here. And this studio that we're in now wasn't even here. It was just a yard and a side. And where the newsroom is located now was an add-on at the same time. So yeah, the station grew quite a bit over the decades.
Yeah. So who was your news team?
When I started, it was Stan Jason, Rich Brenner. I can't remember the young lady's name who did the weather. No, it wasn't Jenny to start off with. It was a student at Randolph-Macon Women's College who came in at 2 o'clock every afternoon, did a news story, and then stayed for the weather at 6 and stayed for the weather at 11. And so, you know, it was a fun time. But there were those 3 folks, then a photographer, and then the assignment editor, news director. Warren Ashmore was his name. So yeah, it was and we were shooting film. I was the 6th guy in a 5-person news department.
And then you worked with Libby.
Worked with Libby Fitzgerald. I worked with, I think, 7 or 8 co-anchors over the years. I anchored the news for about 15 years, starting out as the fill-in, but then becoming the regular anchor in April of '76. And then stayed on until 1990. So, you know, but you've been here longer now. You've been here a lot longer than I was anchor, so. And doing a great job, I might add. And there's some wonderful video of you and doing Good Morning Virginia cut-ins with Tab O'Neill and Laura Lanting. So.
Oh, yes, there is. Those are fun times. And then, of course, you later worked behind the scenes here.
Yeah, I was on the air and did managing editing and executive producing. And then after I left for about 6.5, 7 years and came back as news director. And then I moved over to director of community programming and web services and was a part of the team that did the first website for WSET. Mm-hmm. So we were moving slowly into the digital world, and that all jumped into the digital world in 2008, 2009. From
both your perspective, having worked in it and also just in general knowledge of news, there have been a lot of changes over the years.
Well, the biggest change is the competition that you guys get from social media. And I consider social media the place where fake news rises. And I consider you guys the place where the news and facts take place. Now, there are some bad apples out there that have done some things, and I think that's an anomaly, but on the whole, I think you guys do a great job, and I think you get the facts right, and you present the facts in a way that we can trust. And I think that's very important in this day and age in particular. If folks get their news from social media, they may get some tidbits right here and there, but the whole picture is usually not the right thing.
Yeah. Were you still
That's when I left in 1990.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And you're still very active here in the community.
Very, yeah, I try to be.
Besides being Santa Claus, what you've worked with the Appomattox Economic Development Office, but what else?
Well, I volunteer out at the Appomattox National Historical Park, and I also work with Poplar Forest and do a lot of things out there, conversations with Thomas Jefferson. I still work with the Bateau Festival. I still am big part of the Optimist organization here in town. So, yeah.
Don't you do Wolfbane?
In Wolfbane, yeah, I'm on the Wolfbane Productions Board, and they won a number of big awards for their efforts and what they've done, 9 to be exact. So, yeah, and they're getting ready to open their seats in here before too long. So, yeah, I stay pretty active.
Yeah.
Got to keep moving. If you don't keep moving, you stop.
That's right.
Yeah.
Anything else you wanted to share? Did you have any particular bloopers during your?
Oh yeah. Well, and we had a part of our 50th. We did a 50th anniversary show 20 years ago, and we had a segment. We had a part of that.
But do you remember any particular things happening while you were anchoring that either had you cracking up or that were a huge mistake?
Well, I remember when the electricity went out to the whole area here, and right before the newscast, and we had to set up in the parking lot and do a newscast in the parking lot because the station had no electricity except for the generator that ran the truck to send the stuff to the transmitter. So I mean, it was those were different times, and now I think it's a lot easier, but it's a lot harder in certain ways to do certain things. I mean, certainly the video and the resources you have with the internet and that sort of thing help immensely. And the fact that the pandemic that we just went through stepped up everybody's game as far as doing remote interviews and that sort of thing.
It did.
Concerned. So
that turned out to be a blessing. We had that capability all along, but never used it.
Yeah, and I think it forced you to change. And I think that's one of the things that people need to understand about television. The biggest thing about television and life in general is change. And you don't worry about what's been in the past, you worry about how to build the future. And I think that's extremely important, and I think you've done a great job with it.
What do you think of our new set?
I love it. I love the new set. I remember putting the old one in here and saying this is an old set to begin with that we had inherited from Channel 7 in Washington. It had been up there 8 years already, and then you guys had it for like almost 22 years. You know, you really had to get rid of antiquated. I mean, then the technology changed, and it was like 3 generations, 4 generations technology-wise back. So, and I think you're moving forward, and I think that's very important. Hello, I'm Jeff Taylor, and I anchored the news here at WSET in the last century for 15 years. And I want to wish WSET a happy 70th anniversary and the best in the future.